The German Messerschmitt broke hard left, its pilot confident he had the American in his sights. The bulky P-47 Thunderbolt ahead looked like easy prey, a flying bathtub that couldn't possibly escape. But then something happened that defied every rule of aerial combat the Luftwaffe ace thought he knew. The American pilot pushed his nose down and simply fell out of the sky. The German followed, throttle wide open, determined to claim his kill. At 400 miles per hour, his aircraft began to shake. At 450, the controls went stiff. At 500, the rivets in his wings started screaming. The American kept diving, faster and faster, pulling away like a stone dropped from a cliff. The German pilot had a choice now, pull out or die. And as he fought his bucking controls back toward level flight, one terrible realization crystallized in his mind. The rules of the game had just changed forever. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The spring of 1943 brought a peculiar tension to the skies over occupied France. Luftwaffe pilots gathered in their ready rooms between missions, coffee cups warming their hands as they discussed the latest intelligence reports filtering down from command. The Americans had begun deploying a new fighter in significant numbers, a massive single-seat aircraft that looked more like a medium bomber than a pursuit plane. They called it the Thunderbolt, but the German pilots had other names for it: Flying Oil Drum, the Jug, Fat Bastard. Standing around battered wooden tables with cigarette smoke curling toward cracked ceiling tiles, experienced German pilots who had survived years of combat over Britain, Russia, and the Mediterranean found reasons to smile. This American monster weighed 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice what a Messerschmitt Bf 109 carried into battle. Its enormous radial engine stuck out from the nose like the snout of some prehistoric creature, creating drag that no amount of horsepower could fully overcome. Intelligence photos showed a fighter so bulky that it seemed impossible it could maneuver with anything approaching grace or agility. In a cramped briefing room at Biggin Hill Airfield in southern England, American pilots of the 56th Fighter Group stared at their new mounts with considerably less enthusiasm. Captain Robert Halstead stood with his hands shoved deep in his leather jacket pockets, his breath fogging in the cold March air as he examined the P-47 that ground crews had assigned to his command. The aircraft squatted on the tarmac like a defiant bulldog, its broad wings and massive fuselage making the nearby Spitfires look like racing thoroughbreds by comparison. Halstead had transitioned from P-40 Warhawks in North Africa, where lighter weight and tight turning radius could mean the difference between going home or becoming a smoking crater in the desert sand. Everything about the Thunderbolt contradicted his training and instincts. The cockpit sat so far back on the fuselage that forward visibility on the ground was nearly non-existent. The control column required muscle to move, especially at higher speeds where the control surfaces became stiff and unresponsive. In mock dogfights over the English countryside, the P-47 felt like trying to wrestle a garbage truck through a slalom course. Lieutenant Marcus Brennan, a fresh-faced pilot from Ohio who still had fewer than 10 combat missions under his belt, approached Halstead with a clipboard full of aircraft specifications. His youthful optimism had not yet been ground down by the realities of aerial combat, and he pointed to numbers on the page with genuine excitement. The P-47 could carry 8 50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any fighter in the European theater. Its air-cooled radial engine could absorb punishment that would drop an inline engine fighter from the sky. The aircraft featured a turbocharger system that maintained engine power at altitudes where German fighters began to gasp for oxygen. Halstead listened with the patience of a man who had seen too many young pilots die because they confused impressive specifications with actual combat effectiveness. Numbers on paper meant nothing when a Bf 109 locked onto your 6 o'clock position and you needed to turn inside his guns. The P-47 turned like a pregnant whale, and all the machine guns in the world would not help if you could not bring them to bear on target. The first major engagement came on a cold afternoon in April when a formation of 36 P-47s escorted B-17 flying fortresses toward manufacturing targets deep in occupied France. Halstead flew as element leader in the high cover position, his eyes constantly scanning the brilliant blue sky for the dark specks that would signal incoming German interceptors. The bombers droned ahead in their tight formations, vapor trails streaming behind them like white ribbons against the azure canvas. Radio chatter remained minimal, just the occasional position report or systems check, breaking the static-filled silence. At 28,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, cold enough that any exposed skin would suffer frostbite in seconds. The Thunderbolts maintained their escort positions, weaving gently back and forth above the bomber stream to avoid presenting stationary targets to any lurking enemy fighters. The attack came from above and behind, exactly as Luftwaffe doctrine prescribed. A dozen Bf-109s dove out of the sun in a coordinated bounce, their pilots selecting targets with the precision of men who had executed this maneuver hundreds of times before. The German formation split into pairs, each element focusing on isolated American fighters with textbook efficiency. Halstead saw them coming, 3 seconds before the radio erupted with warnings and curses. He yanked his control column hard right, feeling the Thunderbolt respond with all the alacrity of a freight train changing tracks. Tracer rounds slashed past his canopy, bright points of light that marked the path of 20mm cannon shells capable of tearing his aircraft apart. The German who had targeted him flashed past, a mottled gray-green shape with a yellow nose spinner, already rolling into position for another attack run. Everything Halstead had learned about fighter combat screamed at him to turn inside the German's next pass, to use vertical maneuvers and tight spirals to force an overshoot or create a firing opportunity. But the P-47 would not cooperate. When he tried to haul the nose around for a defensive turn, the aircraft mushed through the air like a truck sliding on ice. The German pilot completed his loop with insulting ease and came around for another attack, clearly confident that this lumbering American pig would never escape his guns. Around the sky, similar dramas played out as Luftwaffe pilots carved through the P-47 formation with practiced skill. 2 American fighters were already trailing smoke, their pilots fighting damaged aircraft toward the dubious safety of the channel. The Germans flew with the arrogance of predators who had just discovered a flock of particularly stupid sheep. Halstead's aircraft shuddered as cannon shells punched through his left wing, leaving ragged holes that immediately began streaming fuel vapor. His instruments flickered and warning lights illuminated across his panel like a Christmas display. The German was setting up for a killing pass, positioning himself perfectly in Halstead's blind spot, where the Thunderbolt's lack of rearward visibility became a fatal liability. In that moment, with his aircraft damaged and his options narrowing to nothing, Halstead made a decision that contradicted every instinct and every hour of training he had received. Instead of trying to turn with his attacker, he pushed his control column forward and pointed his nose at the earth 6 miles below. The Thunderbolt, freed from the constraints of level flight, responded with sudden and shocking enthusiasm. The German pilot saw the American dive and smiled inside his oxygen mask. Diving away was the last refuge of defeated pilots, a desperation move that simply delayed the inevitable. He pushed his own nose down and opened his throttle, confident he could follow the American down and finish him off at leisure. His Bf-109 was one of the finest aircraft in the world, a thoroughbred fighter that had dominated European skies for years. Catching one fat American transport masquerading as a fighter should present no challenge whatsoever. At 10,000 feet, both aircraft were accelerating through 400 miles per hour, well beyond the normal combat speeds where most dogfights occurred. The German pilot felt his controls beginning to stiffen as air pressure built against the control surfaces. This was normal, expected, nothing his strong arms could not handle. At 8,000 feet, Halstead's airspeed indicator crept past 450 miles per hour and kept climbing. The Thunderbolt's massive engine and heavy airframe combined with gravity to create acceleration that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The aircraft's sturdy construction handled the stress without complaint, its thick wings and robust fuselage designed to withstand forces that would tear lighter fighters apart. Behind him, still trying to follow, the German pilot's confident smile had vanished. His aircraft was shaking now, a violent oscillation that made accurate shooting impossible. His airspeed indicator showed 470 miles per hour, faster than he had ever flown in his life, and the Thunderbolt ahead was still pulling away. The German pulled harder on his control column, trying to tighten his dive angle to close the distance. That was his fatal mistake. The Bf-109's wings, beautifully engineered for agility and climb rate, had never been designed for the structural loads of a sustained high-speed dive. At 490 miles per hour, the port wing buckled, metal screamed, rivets popped like machine gun fire, and the entire wing assembly began to fold upward along the spar. The German pilot had 1 second to recognize what was happening before his aircraft disintegrated around him. The Bf-109 tumbled out of the sky in a cloud of debris, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away like autumn leaves in a storm. Halstead, still diving, never saw the German die. He was too focused on his own airspeed, which had just passed 500 miles per hour and was still climbing. At 5,000 feet, he eased back on his control column, feeling the G-forces pile onto his body like sandbags as the Thunderbolt's nose came up. His vision grayed at the edges, and his flight suit's pressure system inflated to keep blood in his brain. The aircraft pulled out of the dive with room to spare, its structure never once complaining about the abuse. When Halstead landed back at Biggin Hill 90 minutes later, his hands were still shaking. Ground crews swarmed his aircraft, pointing at the bullet holes in his wing and shouting questions about the engagement. Halstead climbed down from his cockpit without answering, his legs unsteady on the tarmac. Lieutenant Brennan rushed up with wide eyes and grabbed his arm, asking if he was hurt, if he needed medical attention. Halstead shook his head slowly, still processing what he had just experienced. He had survived not because he outfought the German, but because he had accidentally discovered that his aircraft could do something the enemy's could not. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than anything in the sky, and that single capability had just saved his life. The revelation spread through the fighter groups like wildfire. Pilots who had been complaining about their ponderous new mounts suddenly began looking at their P-47s with new appreciation. If you could not turn with the Germans, you simply did not try. Instead, you used altitude, you used speed, and you used the Thunderbolt's incredible dive performance to dictate the terms of engagement on your own terms. The tactics evolved rapidly through a combination of hard-won experience and creative thinking. American pilots began flying their combat air patrols at higher altitudes than the German fighters typically operated, using the Thunderbolt's excellent turbocharger system to maintain combat power above 30,000 feet, where the Bf-109s began to struggle. From this perch, they could spot German formations below and choose whether to engage or continue escorting their bombers. When they did engage, the new tactics looked nothing like traditional dogfighting. American pilots dove on German formations with tremendous speed, made a single high-speed firing pass, and then used their accumulated velocity to zoom climb back to altitude before the Germans could respond. If a German pilot tried to follow an American dive, he faced a terrible choice. He could abandon the pursuit and let his target escape, or he could push his aircraft into speed ranges where structural failure became increasingly likely. Luftwaffe pilots learned through bitter experience that following a diving Thunderbolt was tantamount to suicide. Their aircraft simply could not handle the stress, and the French countryside became littered with the wreckage of German fighters that had broken apart in high-speed dives. By June of 1943, German pilots over France had developed a healthy respect, bordering on fear for the aircraft they had initially mocked. Luftwaffe squadron commanders issued new tactical directives specifically addressing the P-47 threat. Pilots were instructed to never, under any circumstances, follow a diving Thunderbolt. If an American dove away, let him go. The loss of one potential kill was preferable to losing an experienced pilot and an increasingly irreplaceable fighter. The psychological impact of this restriction rippled through the German fighter force. For years, Luftwaffe pilots had operated with the confidence that came from flying superior equipment, operated by well-trained professionals. Suddenly, they faced an opponent that could simply refuse combat on unfavorable terms, diving away at speeds they could not match, then climbing back to altitude to repeat the process. The hunter had become the hunted, and the skies over France began to tilt in favor of the Americans. Halstead flew his 50th combat mission in August, leading a flight of 4 Thunderbolts on a fighter sweep ahead of the main bomber formation. His aircraft carried external fuel tanks that extended his range deep into German-occupied territory, allowing him to hunt for targets of opportunity far from the relative safety of the English coast. The summer sky was a brilliant blue dome marred only by scattered clouds that cast moving shadows across the green French farmland below. Intelligence had reported a German fighter field near Rouen, and Halstead intended to catch enemy aircraft during their most vulnerable phase, takeoff and landing, when altitude and speed advantages disappeared. They found the field exactly where intelligence had placed it. A grass strip flanked by camouflaged hangars and revetments. 3 Bf-109s were in the landing pattern, their pilots likely returning from an early morning patrol. Halstead dropped his external tanks and pushed his nose down, his flight following in textbook formation. The dive attack happened with brutal efficiency. Halstead selected the lead German fighter, now committed to his landing approach with wheels and flaps extended. At 300 yards, he opened fire, his 8 machine guns converging their fire into a concentrated stream of destruction. The German aircraft staggered as 50 caliber rounds tore through its fuselage and wings. Smoke erupted from the engine, then flames, bright orange tongues that licked back along the airframe. The Bf-109 nosed over and cartwheeled across the grass field in a spectacular tumbling crash that left burning debris scattered across 100 yards. Halstead's wingman took the second German, catching him as he frantically tried to abort his landing and climb away. The remaining 2 P-47s in the flight strafed the airfield infrastructure, their concentrated firepower turning parked aircraft and fuel trucks into blazing pyres. The entire attack lasted less than 90 seconds from first burst to final exit. By the time German anti-aircraft guns began tracking toward the attackers, the 4 Thunderbolts were already climbing away at high speed, using their accumulated dive velocity to claw back to altitude where they could resume their patrol altitude. Behind them, black smoke rose in towering columns from the ruined airfield, visible for miles across the French countryside. The flight back to England should have been routine, but combat never respects expectations. At 25,000 feet over the coast, Halstead's number 3 pilot called out bogeys at 2 o'clock high. 6 Bf-109s. Almost certainly a flight scrambled to intercept the Americans after their airfield attack. The Germans had altitude and position, classic bounce setup that gave them every advantage. Halstead did not hesitate. He called for his flight to maintain formation and continue their climb, pushing their throttles forward to gain as much altitude as possible before the Germans could close the distance. The Thunderbolts clawed upward through the thin air, their turbocharged engines maintaining power, while the pursuing Germans began to struggle. At 30,000 feet, the Americans finally had the altitude they needed. Halstead rolled his aircraft inverted and pulled through into a split S maneuver that pointed his nose straight down. His flight followed, 4 Thunderbolts dropping like bombs toward the earth below. The German formation leader saw the Americans dive and made his decision. He had been briefed about Thunderbolt dive tactics, warned explicitly not to follow them down. But he was an experienced pilot with years of successful combat behind him, and he believed his skill could overcome the American advantage. He signaled his flight to follow and pushed his nose down in pursuit. It was exactly what Halstead had hoped he would do. The dive this time was deliberate, calculated, a trap baited with apparent retreat. Halstead kept his dive angle steep but not vertical, watching his airspeed climb while keeping careful track of his altitude. At 20,000 feet, he was indicating 460 miles per hour. At 15,000 feet, he passed 500. The German formation behind him began to string out as individual pilots reached the limits of what their aircraft could handle. 2 of the Bf-109s pulled out early, their pilots unwilling to risk structural failure. 3 more continued the dive, stubborn or confident, or perhaps simply too focused on their quarry to recognize their danger. At 12,000 feet, the German flight leader's aircraft shed its port aileron. The small control surface simply ripped away from the wing, tumbling end over end through the sky. Without the aileron, the Bf-109 became uncontrollable. Rolling hard to the right, despite the pilot's desperate efforts to correct, the aircraft entered a flat spin and plummeted toward the earth like a falling leaf. The second German pilot, seeing his leader's fate, attempted to pull out immediately. His aircraft had already exceeded safe dive speed by a significant margin, and when he hauled back on his control column, the structural loads exceeded what the airframe could withstand. Both wings folded upward simultaneously, ripping free from the fuselage with explosive violence. The pilot had no chance to bail out. His aircraft fell as wreckage, pieces separating and tumbling independently toward the green fields below. The third German pilot never even attempted to pull out. His airspeed had exceeded 600 miles per hour when his entire tail assembly departed the aircraft. One moment he was flying a fighter, the next he was riding a powerless fuselage with no control surfaces whatsoever. The wreckage augured into a French hillside with enough force to create a crater visible from altitude. Halstead pulled out of his dive at 8,000 feet, his Thunderbolt's sturdy construction handling the stress without complaint. His flight reformed around him, all four aircraft intact and undamaged despite the high-speed maneuvers. Behind them, 3 columns of smoke marked where German pilots had paid the ultimate price for ignoring the lessons their commanders had tried to teach them. The flight continued back to England in silence, each pilot alone with his thoughts. They had just demonstrated that the P-47's greatest weapon was not its guns or its armor or its high-altitude performance. Its greatest weapon was physics itself, the simple reality that heavier, stronger aircraft could do things that lighter fighters could not. The intelligence reports from that engagement rippled through Luftwaffe command structures all the way to Berlin. German engineers analyzed the wreckage of fighters that had broken apart in high-speed dives, measuring structural loads and calculating failure points. Their conclusions were sobering. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that fat, ugly aircraft German pilots had mocked just months earlier, possessed terminal dive speeds that exceeded anything in the Luftwaffe inventory by substantial margins. Attempts to follow diving Thunderbolts resulted in predictable structural failures that killed experienced pilots and destroyed increasingly irreplaceable aircraft. New tactical directives went out to every fighter unit on the Western Front. These orders emphasized in bold type and underlined for effect: do not pursue diving P-47s. Do not follow them down. Let them go. For German pilots who had spent years dominating European skies through superior equipment and training, these orders represented a profound psychological defeat. The very essence of fighter combat involved pursuit, chasing down enemy aircraft and destroying them. Now they were being told that against this one particular opponent, pursuit itself was forbidden. The Americans had found a way to win that required no exceptional skill, no brilliant tactics, just simple physics and an aircraft tough enough to handle the stress. A mediocre pilot in a P-47 could escape an ace in a Bf-109 simply by pointing his nose at the ground and letting gravity do the work. The implications extended far beyond individual dogfights. American fighters could now penetrate deep into occupied Europe, strike targets at will, and escape with relative impunity whenever German interceptors appeared. By autumn of 1943, the P-47 had transformed from a liability into the backbone of American fighter operations over Europe. New fighter groups equipped with Thunderbolts arrived in England at a steady pace, their pilots already trained in the dive and zoom tactics that exploited the aircraft's unique capabilities. The production lines back in the United States churned out Thunderbolts by the thousands, far outpacing Germany's ability to replace lost fighters. Each new American pilot learned the same basic lesson during their initial combat missions. When Germans attack, use altitude and speed. Make your pass, take your shots, and dive away if things get complicated. The Thunderbolt will protect you. Its massive engine will absorb damage that would down other fighters, and its dive speed will get you out of trouble faster than anything else in the sky. Halstead flew his 100th mission in December, leading a full squadron of 16 Thunderbolts on a bomber escort mission to Frankfurt. The weather was miserable, thick clouds and occasional snow showers that reduced visibility to mere hundreds of yards. The bomber formation ahead was barely visible, just dark shapes moving through the gray murk. German fighters probed the escort constantly, making quick passes and then disappearing back into the clouds before the Americans could respond effectively. It was the kind of combat that depended on split-second decisions and instant reactions, where the margin between success and catastrophe measured in heartbeats. Halstead kept his formation tight, each flight of 4 aircraft maintaining visual contact despite the challenging conditions. When Germans appeared, the Americans responded with their practiced tactics, diving through the attacks and using speed to reposition before zooming back to altitude. The The mission lasted 4 hours, an exhausting grind through hostile skies where every moment demanded absolute focus and attention. By the time the bombers turned for home, Halstead's squadron had expended thousands of rounds of ammunition and consumed massive amounts of fuel fighting off repeated German attacks. 3 American bombers had gone down, their crews lost somewhere in the clouds over Germany, but the remaining bombers had reached their target and dropped their bombs, and the fighter escort had prevented the losses from being far worse. It was not a victory in the traditional sense, but it represented the grinding attritional warfare that would eventually overwhelm Germany's ability to defend its airspace. When Halstead landed back in England that evening, ground crews noticed something unusual about his aircraft. The Thunderbolt's massive propeller blades were bent backward, the tips curled from striking something during one of his high-speed dives. The damage suggested he had exceeded 700 miles per hour at some point during the mission, a speed so extreme that the propeller tips had encountered supersonic airflow and deformed from the stress. The aircraft itself showed no other damage, its structure completely sound despite the incredible forces involved. Ground crews shook their heads in wonder, marveling at the punishment the P-47 could absorb and still bring its pilot home safely. The war continued for another year and a half, the Thunderbolt remaining a mainstay of American fighter operations throughout. Later, Model P-47s incorporated improvements based on combat experience, adding more fuel capacity, refined turbocharger systems, and various detail improvements that enhanced overall performance. But the core advantage remained unchanged. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than anything else in the sky, and that single capability forced German pilots to fight on American terms. The psychological impact was perhaps more important than the tactical advantages. German pilots knew that any engagement with Thunderbolts could end with the Americans simply diving away at speeds that made pursuit suicidal. This knowledge eroded confidence and forced defensive mindsets that favored the attackers. Halstead survived the war, with 153 combat missions and 11 confirmed kills. He returned to the United States in the summer of 1945, his uniform decorated with medals and his head full of memories both glorious and terrible. In interviews decades later, he always returned to the same theme when discussing the P-47. The Thunderbolt was not the fastest fighter in level flight, not the most maneuverable, not the one that pilots dreamed of flying when they imagined themselves as fighter aces, but it was tough, incredibly tough, and it could do one thing better than any other aircraft in the world. It could dive like a stone and pull out safely at speeds that destroyed other fighters. That single capability had saved his life more times than he could count, and it had changed the nature of aerial combat over Europe. The Germans had learned too late that mocking the P-47's ungainly appearance was a fatal mistake. By the time they understood what the Thunderbolt could do, their pilots were already dying in increasing numbers, and their tactical doctrine was in shambles. The legacy of the P-47 extended beyond its combat record. Engineers studied the Thunderbolt's structural design, learning lessons about building aircraft that could withstand extreme stress loads. The knowledge gained from analyzing high-speed dive performance contributed to post-war fighter development, informing the design of jet aircraft that would routinely operate at speeds the P-47 could only reach in vertical dives. Pilots who flew the Thunderbolt carried its lessons forward into peacetime, teaching new generations that victory in combat sometimes came not from outfighting the enemy, but from refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The fat, ugly, slow Thunderbolt had proven that raw capability mattered more than graceful lines, that physics trumped aesthetics, and that the aircraft mocked by its enemies could become their worst nightmare. In the decades after the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots occasionally encountered their American counterparts at air shows and reunions. These meetings were usually cordial, former enemies sharing stories and comparing experiences with the perspective that only time and survival can provide. When the conversation turned to the P-47, German pilots always became thoughtful, their expressions mixing respect with remembered frustration. They told stories about watching Thunderbolts dive away at impossible speeds, about the standing orders not to follow, about the friends who had ignored those orders and paid with their lives. The Americans would nod and share their own memories, recounting the terror of being bounced by German fighters and the relief of knowing their aircraft could simply dive away from trouble. Both sides understood that the P-47 had changed everything. shows that its introduction had marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The Germans had learned to laugh at the Thunderbolt's appearance, but they had learned too late to fear its capabilities. And by then, the sky belonged to America.